They say trust is the foundation of marriage, but what happens when that foundation is built on quicksand? My name is Jessica Thompson, and for 8 years, I believed I was living the American dream in our lakefront home in Austin, Texas. I was a financial analyst who could spot inconsistencies in corporate budgets from miles away, yet somehow I missed the biggest financial fraud happening right under my own roof. Or maybe I didn't miss it at all. Maybe I saw the signs, documented every suspicious transaction, and waited 3 long years for the perfect moment to expose the man who thought he was smarter than his wife. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I remember the exact moment my world shifted from naive trust to calculated observation. It was a Tuesday evening in March, 3 years before I filed for divorce. Michael had just returned from what he called a client dinner in Dallas, but something felt off. His shirt smelled like expensive perfume, not the kind I wore, and there was a charge on our joint credit card for a restaurant I'd never heard of. But what really caught my attention wasn't the potential affair. It was the cash deposit he made the next morning for exactly $3,000. Michael Thompson was a real estate developer, and cash transactions weren't unusual in his business, but this deposit didn't match any of the deals I knew about. And when I casually asked him about it over breakfast, his explanation was too quick, too rehearsed. He said it was earnest money from a small property flip, but the math didn't add up. That's when I realized my husband might be hiding more than just late-night dinners. As a financial analyst for a corporate consulting firm, I'd spent my career following money trails and identifying discrepancies in complex financial statements. I knew how people hid money, how they underreported income, and how they created elaborate paper trails to disguise their actual worth. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to use these skills on my own husband, the man who used to joke that he was lucky to have married someone who could manage their finances so well. That night, while Michael slept peacefully beside me, I started what would become the most important project of my life. I opened a new folder on my laptop, password protected and buried deep in a directory labeled Work Miscellaneous. Inside, I created a simple spreadsheet with 3 columns: date, transaction, and source. The first entry was that mysterious $3,000 deposit, along with a note about his explanation and why it didn't align with his known business activities. What started as curiosity quickly became a systematic investigation. I began paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The way Michael would take phone calls in the garage, claiming the reception was better out there. How he'd developed a sudden interest in checking the mail before I got home from work. The fact that he'd started insisting on handling all our tax preparations himself, even though I was clearly more qualified to manage our financial documents. Over the following months, I discovered a pattern that made my stomach turn. Michael wasn't just having an affair. He was systematically moving money out of our joint accounts and into places I couldn't trace. Small amounts at first, $500 here, $1,000 there, always with explanations that sounded reasonable if you weren't looking for inconsistencies. He'd claim he'd paid contractors in cash, or that he'd made deposits into business accounts that would be transferred back later. But the money never came back. I started photographing bank statements before he could file them away. I installed a small recording device in his home office, hidden inside a picture frame I'd given him for our anniversary. I copied receipts from his wallet when he was in the shower. Every suspicious transaction, every unexplained expense, every cash withdrawal that didn't match his stated business activities went into my growing file. I felt like a detective investigating my own life, and the evidence I was gathering painted a picture of a man who had been planning his exit strategy for years. The most damning discovery came 6 months into my investigation. While organizing Michael's desk drawer to surprise him with a clean workspace, I found a business card for an offshore banking consultant based in the Cayman Islands. When I researched the company online, I discovered they specialized in helping individuals establish anonymous shell corporations and international accounts that were nearly impossible to trace through conventional divorce proceedings. The consultation fee alone was $25,000, money that had mysteriously disappeared from our home equity line of credit 3 months earlier. That's when I realized Michael wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to leave me with nothing. Every dollar he was hiding was a dollar he intended to keep when our marriage inevitably ended. He was conducting financial warfare against his own wife. And he thought I was too trusting, too in love, too naive to notice. He'd underestimated the one person who had access to all his financial information and the professional skills to interpret what she was seeing. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was continuing to live normally while documenting his deception. I had to smile at dinner parties where he bragged about his latest real estate deals, knowing that half the profits were being funneled into accounts I'd never see. I had to listen to him complain about our household budget while secretly photographing receipts that proved he'd spent our vacation fund on jewelry for another woman. I had to share a bed with someone who was actively stealing from me, all while maintaining the facade of a happy marriage. My sister Amanda noticed the change in me first. We were having lunch at our favorite cafe in downtown Austin when she pointed out that I'd barely touched my food and seemed distracted. Amanda was 2 years younger than me, a kindergarten teacher with an optimistic view of the world that I envied. She still believed that people were fundamentally good, that marriages could be saved with communication and counseling, that love could overcome any obstacle. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to show her the spreadsheets and the photographs and the recordings that proved my husband was systematically looting our shared assets. But I also knew that Amanda would want me to confront Michael immediately, to demand explanations and ultimatums that would only alert him to my investigation. So instead, I told her I was going through a rough patch at work, that I was stressed about some difficult clients, and that everything was fine at home. The lie tasted bitter in my mouth, but it was necessary. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The success of my documentation project depended on Michael never suspecting that I knew what he was doing. I had to be the same trusting wife I'd always been, the woman who signed papers without reading them carefully, who believed his explanations about business expenses, who never questioned his need for financial privacy. I had to let him think he was outsmarting me while I built an airtight case against him. My friend Rachel Kim became my lifeline during this period, though she didn't know it at the time. Rachel and I had been college roommates, and she'd gone on to become a forensic accountant specializing in divorce cases. We met for drinks every few weeks, and I'd carefully steer our conversations toward hypothetical scenarios about hidden assets and financial fraud. I'd ask questions about how someone might hide money during a divorce, what red flags attorneys looked for, and what kind of evidence was most compelling in court. Rachel would answer my questions enthusiastically, thinking I was just curious about her work. She'd explain how sophisticated spouses could be in hiding assets, how they'd undervalue businesses, create fake debts to friends, or establish trusts in other states with favorable asset protection laws. Every piece of information she shared helped me understand what Michael was doing and how to document it more effectively. By the end of my first year of investigation, I had compiled over 200 pages of evidence: bank statements showing unexplained transfers, photographs of receipts for items I'd never seen, recordings of phone conversations where Michael discussed financial strategies with people I'd never met. I'd traced money flowing from our joint accounts into a network of LLCs with names like Austin Property Holdings and Lone Star Development Group. I'd discovered credit cards in his name that I'd never known about, each carrying balances that suggested a lifestyle far more expensive than what we appeared to be living. The most devastating evidence came from a conversation I'd recorded in his home office. Michael was on the phone with his business partner, David Chen, discussing their strategy for the upcoming year. David mentioned that they should be careful about how they structured their deals, given that Michael was planning some personal changes and needed to keep things clean for the lawyers. Michael laughed and said that his wife was too trusting and that she'd never think to look beyond their joint accounts. Hearing my own husband discuss my naivety as a strategic advantage in his plan to defraud me was a moment that crystallized everything. This wasn't just about money or even infidelity. This was about a man who saw his wife as an obstacle to overcome rather than a partner to respect. He was counting on my love, my trust, and my desire to preserve our marriage to blind me to his systematic theft. He thought my emotional investment in our relationship would make me an easy target. That's when I stopped seeing myself as a betrayed wife and started seeing myself as what I actually was: a financial analyst who had uncovered a complex fraud scheme. The emotion didn't disappear, but it became fuel for my investigation rather than a weakness to be exploited. Michael wanted to play financial chess with someone he thought was only capable of checkers. He was about to discover just how wrong he'd been about his wife's capabilities. The second year of my documentation project brought even more shocking revelations. I discovered that Michael had been systematically undervaluing his real estate projects in our financial disclosures while simultaneously taking out loans against their true worth. He'd partnered with contractors who would provide two sets of invoices, one showing inflated costs for our tax purposes, and another showing the actual amounts paid, with the difference flowing into accounts I couldn't access. I found evidence of a sophisticated money laundering operation disguised as legitimate business transactions. Michael would purchase services from consulting companies that existed only on paper, paying them substantial fees for work that was never performed. The money would then be transferred through a series of shell corporations before ending up in offshore accounts. It was elegant in its complexity and devastating in its implications for our financial future. What hurt most wasn't the money itself, but the realization that Michael had been planning this deception for years, possibly from the very beginning of our marriage. I found documents suggesting that he'd started establishing his hidden financial infrastructure shortly after we'd bought our lakefront house. Every major milestone in our relationship, buying the house, talking about starting a family, planning for our future, had been accompanied by Michael creating new ways to hide assets from his wife. I began to question every moment of our 8-year marriage. Had he ever loved me? Or had I always been just a convenient cover for his business activities? Was our entire relationship built on his calculation that a financial analyst wife would provide credibility for his legitimate business dealings while being too emotionally invested to investigate his illegitimate ones? The man I'd fallen in love with, the man I'd trusted with my heart and my future, had been conducting a long-term con game against me. But Michael had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that my love for him would make me willfully blind to his deception. He'd counted on my desire to preserve our marriage to keep me from asking difficult questions. He'd expected that my trust in him would override my professional instincts and analytical skills. Instead, my love for him had motivated me to become the most thorough investigator he'd ever encountered. By the third year of my documentation project, I had evidence of financial fraud that went far beyond simple asset hiding. I'd uncovered tax evasion, money laundering, and what appeared to be investor fraud in several of his real estate projects. My file had grown to include audio recordings, photographed documents, bank records, and a detailed timeline that showed the evolution of his deceptive practices. I had enough evidence to not only ensure a favorable divorce settlement, but potentially to send Michael to federal prison. The irony was that the better I became at uncovering his deception, the more normal our relationship appeared to outside observers. I'd learned to compartmentalize my investigation from my daily life, to smile and play the role of the supportive wife, while secretly documenting every lie he told me. We attended dinner parties and social events where Michael would charm everyone with his success stories, never knowing that his wife was mentally cataloging which of his claims were contradicted by the evidence in her hidden files. Our friends and family saw a successful couple living the Texas dream. Michael was the charismatic entrepreneur building a real estate empire, and I was the brilliant financial analyst who'd helped him achieve his success. We lived in a beautiful house, drove nice cars, and seemed to have the kind of partnership that others envied. No one suspected that behind the facade of marital bliss, I was conducting the most important investigation of my career. The decision to finally file for divorce came not from an emotional breaking point, but from a strategic calculation. After 3 years of documentation, I had enough evidence to ensure not only that Michael couldn't hide his assets, but that he'd face serious legal consequences for his financial crimes. I'd identified every account, every shell corporation, every hidden asset, and every fraudulent transaction. I'd built a case so comprehensive that no judge would believe his claims of innocence, and no forensic accountant would be able to poke holes in my evidence. More importantly, I'd discovered that Michael was planning to escalate his deception. I'd found documents suggesting that he was preparing to transfer even more substantial assets offshore, and that he was considering filing for divorce himself within the next 6 months. He wanted to control the timing and the narrative, to position himself as the wronged party who'd finally had enough of his wife's supposed shortcomings. He was planning to leave me not just financially devastated, but publicly humiliated. That's when I realized that my 3 years of patient documentation had given me something Michael could never have anticipated: the element of surprise. He thought he was playing a game where only he knew the rules. He was about to discover that his wife had not only learned the rules, but had been playing by different ones entirely. The financial analyst who'd been quietly building spreadsheets in the background was about to become the most dangerous opponent he'd ever faced. The divorce papers hit Michael like a carefully calculated missile strike. I filed on a Tuesday morning at the Travis County Courthouse, choosing the timing specifically because I knew he had a major investor meeting that afternoon. I wanted him off balance, scrambling to understand what had just happened while trying to maintain his professional composure. The petition was straightforward: irreconcilable differences, request for equitable distribution of assets, spousal support consideration. Nothing that would immediately alert him to the depth of my knowledge about his hidden financial empire. His reaction was exactly what I'd anticipated. The phone started ringing within an hour of the papers being served. Michael's voice was strained, confused, almost desperate. He asked if we could talk, if there was something we could work out, if this was really necessary. He used all the words I'd once longed to hear: commitment, counseling, compromise. But now they sounded hollow, calculated. Responses from a man who was suddenly realizing his carefully constructed plan was falling apart. I let him talk. I played the role of the emotional wife who'd finally reached her breaking point, who couldn't handle the stress of our relationship anymore, who needed space to figure things out. I gave him exactly the narrative he expected, the one that would make him believe this was an impulsive decision driven by female emotion, rather than a strategic move backed by 3 years of meticulous evidence gathering. He bought it completely. Within a week, Michael's legal team made their first major mistake. His attorney, Jonathan Walsh, a man who specialized in protecting wealthy clients' assets during divorce proceedings, filed a motion requesting immediate mediation. The motion included Michael's sworn financial affidavit, a document that was supposed to provide a complete picture of our marital assets. I read through it carefully, comparing every line to the evidence I'd compiled over the previous 3 years. The discrepancies were staggering. Michael had listed our joint checking account, our savings account, his retirement fund, and the estimated value of our house. He'd included his legitimate business, Thompson Development LLC, with a valuation that was approximately 60% of its actual worth. But there was no mention of the offshore accounts, the shell corporations, the hidden credit cards, or the network of fraudulent consulting companies that had been funneling money away from our marriage for years. His financial affidavit was essentially a confession to perjury, and he'd filed it with the court under penalty of law. I made copies of everything and added them to my evidence file, which by now filled 3 large binders and 2 external hard drives. Every lie he told in his official court documents was contradicted by bank statements, photographs, and recorded conversations I'd collected. He was digging his own legal grave, and he didn't even realize the shovel was in his hands. The next phase of his strategy became clear when he filed for temporary spousal support. Michael claimed that I had been the primary breadwinner during our marriage and that he'd sacrificed his earning potential to support my career advancement. It was a brilliant legal maneuver. By claiming financial dependence on me, he could position himself as the economically vulnerable party, while simultaneously explaining away any major assets he might have hidden. If he appeared to have no money, no one would question why he wasn't paying spousal support to me. But Michael's claim fell apart when compared to our actual tax returns, which I'd been copying and storing for years. The returns showed that his income from Thompson Development had consistently exceeded my salary as a financial analyst. More importantly, they showed a pattern of underreported income that would be impossible to explain if examined closely. Michael had been claiming poverty on his divorce documents while simultaneously reporting substantial business income to the IRS. The contradiction would be devastating if properly presented to the court. His attorney began employing increasingly aggressive tactics as the case progressed. They demanded extensive financial discovery from me, requesting bank statements, employment records, investment portfolios, and detailed expense reports. It was a fishing expedition designed to overwhelm me with paperwork, while simultaneously looking for any financial irregularities they could use against me. They were hoping I'd made some minor mistake they could blow out of proportion, or that I'd hidden some small asset they could present as evidence of my own dishonesty. I complied with every request meticulously. My financial records were immaculate because I'd been managing them with the precision of a professional analyst for 8 years. Every transaction was documented, every expense was justified, every investment was properly reported. I had nothing to hide, which put me in the unusual position of being the only party in the divorce proceeding whose financial disclosures were completely honest. The irony wasn't lost on me that Michael's legal team was demanding transparency from me while their client was committing ongoing fraud against the court. Every motion they filed, every discovery request they made, every aggressive legal tactic they employed was building a stronger case for why Michael deserved severe sanctions when his deception was eventually revealed. They were establishing a pattern of bad faith that would make it impossible for him to claim ignorance or honest mistake when confronted with evidence of his hidden assets. 3 months into the divorce proceedings, Michael made his most devastating error. Believing that I was financially naive and legally outmatched, he attempted to buy me out with a settlement offer that was insultingly low. He offered me $50,000 in cash, my car, and my personal belongings in exchange for waiving all claims to marital property. The offer was presented as generous, given his claimed financial difficulties and the supposed burden of the mortgage payments he'd have to manage alone. The settlement offer was accompanied by a detailed hardship statement from Michael, explaining how the divorce was destroying him financially and emotionally. He claimed that his business was failing, that he was behind on mortgage payments, and that he'd had to take on substantial debt just to pay his legal fees. The document was filled with specific financial claims that I knew were completely false, each one contradicted by evidence in my files. I had Michael exactly where I wanted him. He'd now committed perjury in his initial financial affidavit, made false claims in his spousal support motion, and submitted fraudulent hardship statements to the court. Every lie he told was a federal crime, and every document he filed was evidence of his willingness to defraud both his wife and the legal system. He'd transformed what could have been a straightforward asset division into a criminal conspiracy against the court. My attorney, Patricia Reeves, was a sharp woman who specialized in complex financial litigation. I'd chosen her carefully after researching every divorce attorney in Austin, looking for someone who understood sophisticated asset hiding techniques and wasn't intimidated by aggressive opposing counsel. Patricia had built her reputation by uncovering hidden assets in high-net-worth divorces, and she'd never lost a case involving financial fraud. When I first met with Patricia, I'd presented myself as a concerned wife who suspected her husband might be hiding some assets but wasn't sure how to prove it. I gave her just enough information to pique her interest without revealing the full extent of my investigation. I wanted her to guide the official discovery process while I provided strategic direction based on my private research. It was a delicate balance. I needed her expertise and legal authority, but I couldn't reveal that I'd been conducting what amounted to an unauthorized surveillance operation against my own husband. Patricia immediately recognized the red flags in Michael's financial disclosures. She'd seen similar patterns in dozens of other cases, and she knew exactly how to probe for hidden assets. She filed motions requesting detailed business records, bank statements from all accounts Michael had ever accessed, and sworn testimony from his business associates. Each request was carefully crafted to uncover specific types of financial deception, and each was designed to put Michael in the impossible position of either admitting to his fraud or committing additional perjury. The discovery process revealed just how sophisticated Michael's deception had become. When compelled to produce business records for Thompson Development, he submitted financial statements that bore no resemblance to the actual transactions I'd been documenting. He'd created an entirely parallel set of books, one that showed modest profits and reasonable business expenses, while the real money flowed through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts that weren't mentioned anywhere in his court filings. Patricia's forensic accountant, a brilliant woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, began analyzing the financial records with the precision of a surgeon. Dr. Chen specialized in tracing hidden assets and had worked on cases involving everything from corporate embezzlement to international money laundering. She immediately identified inconsistencies in Michael's business records that suggested systematic fraud, and she began the painstaking process of following the money trail. What Dr. Chen didn't know was that I'd already followed that trail for 3 years. I had copies of the real financial statements, photographs of the actual bank records, and recordings of conversations where Michael discussed his asset-hiding strategies with his business partners. I was essentially watching a professional investigator discover the same evidence I'd already compiled, but through official legal channels that would make it admissible in court. The psychological toll of maintaining my facade while watching the legal process unfold was enormous. I had to continue living in the same house with Michael while knowing that every conversation we had was potentially being used against me in court. He'd become suspicious and paranoid, convinced that I was working with investigators to spy on his business activities. He wasn't wrong, but he didn't realize that the investigator was his own wife. Michael began changing his behavior in ways that actually made my documentation easier. He started conducting more business from home, apparently believing that his house was safer than his office. He held conference calls in rooms where I'd already planted recording devices, and he left financial documents in places where I could easily photograph them. His paranoia about external surveillance made him careless about internal security. The most damaging evidence came from a conversation Michael had with his business partner, David Chen, during a barbecue at our house. Michael had invited David over ostensibly to discuss legitimate business matters, but their conversation quickly turned to strategies for protecting assets during the divorce. They discussed moving money to accounts in countries without extradition treaties, creating fake debts to friends and family members, and potentially declaring bankruptcy for some of Michael's shell companies to make them appear worthless. Q recorded the entire conversation from inside the house while pretending to prepare food in the kitchen. Michael and David sat on our back deck, overlooking the lake, discussing federal crimes as casually as they might talk about weekend plans. They laughed about how wives never understood business complexity, how divorce attorneys were too lazy to trace sophisticated financial structures, and how easy it was to hide assets from people who didn't understand international banking. The recording was devastating not just because of what they discussed, but because of how they discussed it. Michael spoke about defrauding his wife, me, with casual contempt, as if I were an obstacle to overcome rather than a person whose life he was destroying. He described his plan to leave me financially ruined while he started a new life with assets I'd never be able to find. The cruelty in his voice was more painful than any of his financial crimes. But the recording also revealed something that changed my entire strategy. Michael mentioned that he was planning to propose to his girlfriend, Stephanie Walsh, as soon as the divorce was final. Stephanie had been my friend, someone I'd trusted and confided in during some of the darkest moments of my marriage. She'd listened to me worry about Michael's distant behavior, offered comfort when I questioned whether our relationship was solid, and provided support when I wondered if I was imagining problems that didn't exist. Learning that Stephanie had been Michael's accomplice all along was a betrayal that cut deeper than his financial crimes. She'd been feeding him information about my emotional state, my suspicions, and my concerns about our marriage. Every conversation I'd had with her, every moment of vulnerability I'd shared, had been reported back to Michael as intelligence about his wife's mental state. She'd helped him calibrate his deception to keep me off balance and unsuspecting. The revelation about Stephanie also explained several things that had puzzled me during my investigation. Michael had seemed unusually confident about my reactions to certain situations, as if he knew exactly how much suspicion I could handle before becoming truly concerned. He'd adjusted his lies and explanations with a precision that suggested inside knowledge of my psychological state. Now I understood that my trusted friend had been his informant all along. I realized that Michael's plan was even more sophisticated than I'd initially understood. He wasn't just hiding assets for the divorce, he was orchestrating a complete life transition. He would emerge from our marriage with all his wealth intact, ready to start fresh with a woman who'd helped him destroy his previous relationship. They'd probably been planning this for years, with Stephanie playing the role of the supportive friend while secretly working to undermine my marriage. But Michael and Stephanie had made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that their victim was naive, trusting, and emotionally dependent. They'd counted on my friendship with Stephanie to keep me from suspecting her involvement, and they'd relied on my love for Michael to prevent me from investigating his business activities too closely. They'd treated me like a target to be manipulated rather than an adversary to be respected. As I listened to Michael and David laugh about their criminal conspiracy, I felt the last remnants of my emotional attachment to my husband finally dissolve. This wasn't the man I'd fallen in love with 8 years ago. This was a calculating sociopath who'd built his life around deception and manipulation, who saw other people as obstacles or opportunities rather than human beings deserving of respect and honesty. I spent that night organizing my evidence files and preparing for the next phase of my plan. I had everything I needed to destroy Michael's fraudulent financial empire, but I wanted to do it in a way that would maximize the impact and minimize his ability to escape consequences. The patient, methodical approach that had served me so well during the investigation phase would now be applied to his complete destruction. The legal system moved slowly, but my preparation had been thorough, enough to ensure that every development worked in my favor. Patricia's official discovery requests uncovered evidence that corroborated everything in my private files, but through legal channels that Michael couldn't challenge or dismiss. Dr. Chen's forensic analysis identified the same patterns of fraud I'd been documenting, but with the professional credibility that would make them devastating in court. 6 months into the divorce proceedings, Michael's attorney made a settlement offer that revealed just how desperate they'd become. They offered me $200,000 in cash and the house in exchange for waiving all claims to Michael's business assets. It was 4 times their original offer, but still represented less than 10% of Michael's actual net worth. They were essentially offering me pocket change in exchange for letting him keep millions of dollars in hidden assets. I instructed Patricia to reject the offer and continue with discovery. Michael's legal team immediately filed a motion claiming that I was prolonging the proceedings unnecessarily and acting in bad faith. They argued that their client had made generous settlement offers that any reasonable person would accept, and that my refusal to negotiate demonstrated malicious intent to damage Michael's business reputation. The motion was a strategic error that revealed their desperation. By claiming that Michael had made generous offers, they were implicitly admitting that he had access to substantial assets that weren't reflected in his financial disclosures. They'd essentially argued that their client was wealthy enough to make large settlement payments while simultaneously claiming that he was too poor to pay spousal support. The contradiction would be impossible to explain when we reached trial. As the discovery process continued, Michael's behavior became increasingly erratic. He knew that investigators were closing in on his hidden assets, but he couldn't figure out how they'd obtained such detailed information about his financial activities. He suspected that someone in his organization was feeding information to my legal team, and he began conducting business with a level of paranoia that actually made him more vulnerable to surveillance. Michael started changing banks, closing accounts, and moving money between different shell companies in an apparent attempt to stay ahead of the investigation. But every move he made created new documentation that could be traced and analyzed. His efforts to hide assets were actually creating a clearer picture of his fraudulent activities, and his panic was causing him to make mistakes that would have been easy to avoid if he'd remained calm. The most damaging mistake came when Michael attempted to transfer $2 million to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The transaction was flagged by federal banking authorities as a potential money laundering operation, and it triggered an investigation by the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Michael had inadvertently drawn federal's attention to his asset hiding activities, transforming what could have been a civil divorce matter into a criminal investigation. When the federal investigation became public knowledge, Michael's carefully constructed business empire began to collapse. His legitimate clients started questioning whether they wanted to be associated with someone under investigation for financial crimes. His business partners began distancing themselves from Thompson Development, concerned about their own liability if Michael's activities were found to be criminal. His investors demanded immediate audits of all projects they'd funded, worried that their money might have been diverted to Michael's personal accounts. The irony was perfect. Michael had spent years building a sophisticated system to hide assets from his wife, but his own greed and paranoia had attracted the attention of federal investigators who had resources and authority that far exceeded anything available in a civil divorce proceeding. He'd transformed a private family matter into a public criminal case, and he'd done it entirely through his own actions. As I watched Michael's world crumble around him, I felt a satisfaction that was both complete and cold. This wasn't the emotional revenge of a spurned wife. It was the logical consequence of a criminal's own choices. Every penalty he faced, every asset he lost, every relationship he destroyed was the direct result of decisions he'd made freely and deliberately. I hadn't destroyed Michael's life. I'd simply documented it thoroughly enough that his own actions became impossible to ignore or excuse. The morning I received the call from Dr. Sarah Chen changed everything. Her voice was carefully controlled, professional, but I could hear the excitement underneath. She'd found something in Michael's financial records that went beyond simple asset hiding. The forensic analysis had uncovered a pattern of transactions that suggested Michael had been stealing from his own clients, using their investment funds to prop up his personal lifestyle while creating fake documentation to hide the theft. I listened to Dr. Chen explain her findings while sitting in my car outside the grocery store, scribbling notes on the back of a receipt. Michael had been operating what amounted to a Ponzi scheme through Thompson Development, taking money from new investors to pay returns to earlier ones while siphoning substantial amounts into his personal accounts. The sophistication of the operation was staggering. He'd created fake property valuations, forged construction contracts, and even staged property developments that existed only on paper. But what struck me most wasn't the complexity of Michael's crimes. It was the realization that I'd been living with a stranger for 8 years. The man I'd fallen in love with, the man I'd trusted with my future, had been a criminal mastermind operating under the cover of a legitimate real estate business. Every success story he'd shared with me, every celebration of a completed project, every moment of pride in his business accomplishments had been built on lies and theft. That night, I sat in my home office and spread out all the evidence I'd collected over 3 years. Bank statements, photographs, recordings, financial documents, 3 years of methodical investigation that had captured every detail of Michael's criminal enterprise. But for the first time, I wasn't looking at the evidence as documentation of my husband's betrayal. I was looking at it as proof of my own transformation. The woman who'd started this investigation 3 years ago had been naive, trusting, and emotionally dependent on her husband's approval. She'd believed that love and loyalty would be reciprocated, that honesty was the foundation of marriage, and that her role was to support and enable her husband's success. That woman had been easy to manipulate because she'd wanted to believe the best about everyone, especially the man she'd chosen to marry. But somewhere during those 3 years of patient documentation, that woman had died. In her place was someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. Someone who understood that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, that evidence was more valuable than emotion, and that her greatest strength lay not in her capacity for love, but in her ability to think systematically and plan strategically. I'd spent so much time focused on what Michael had taken from me that I'd almost missed what I'd gained. My investigation had transformed me from a victim into a predator, from someone who reacted to circumstances into someone who controlled them. Michael thought he was playing chess against an amateur, but he'd actually been facing a grandmaster who'd been planning her moves 3 years in advance. The evidence I'd collected wasn't just documentation of Michael's crimes. It was proof of my own evolution from a trusting wife into a forensic investigator capable of uncovering complex financial fraud. Every bank statement I'd photographed, every conversation I'd recorded, every transaction I'd traced demonstrated skills and instincts I'd never known I possessed. Michael's betrayal had forced me to become someone stronger, smarter, and more capable than I'd ever imagined possible. My sister Amanda visited me that weekend, bringing homemade cookies and her usual optimistic concern for my well-being. She'd been worried about me throughout the divorce proceedings, convinced that I was handling things too calmly and that I needed to express more emotion about the end of my marriage. Amanda believed in the healing power of tears, in the importance of grieving openly, and in the necessity of forgiveness for moving forward. As we sat in my kitchen, Amanda gently probed about my emotional state. She wanted to know if I was angry with Michael, if I was struggling with feelings of betrayal, if I was worried about my financial future. Her questions were well-intentioned, but revealed how little she understood about what I'd been going through. She saw me as a woman whose marriage had failed, not as an investigator who'd uncovered a criminal conspiracy. I wanted to tell Amanda everything. I wanted to show her the evidence files, play her the recordings, explain the sophisticated financial crimes I'd documented. I wanted her to understand that this wasn't a story about a failed marriage. It was a story about a woman who'd discovered her own strength by facing an enemy who'd underestimated her completely. But I also knew that Amanda wouldn't understand the satisfaction I felt in outmaneuvering Michael, the pride I took in my investigative work, or the cold determination that had replaced my capacity for forgiveness. Instead, I told Amanda that I was doing better than expected, that the divorce proceedings were going smoothly, and that I was looking forward to starting fresh. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. I was doing much better than expected because I'd spent 3 years preparing for this moment. The proceedings were going smoothly because I had evidence that made Michael's position indefensible. And I was looking forward to starting fresh, but not in the way Amanda imagined. My conversation with Amanda made me realize how completely I'd isolated myself during the investigation years. I'd been so focused on documenting Michael's deception that I'd stopped sharing my real thoughts and feelings with anyone. My relationship with my family had become performative, designed to maintain the facade of normalcy while I conducted my secret investigation. Even my friendship with Rachel had become strategic, a way to gather information about forensic accounting, techniques without revealing my true purpose. The isolation had been necessary for the success of my mission, but it had also fundamentally changed who I was. I'd become comfortable with deception, skilled at maintaining false personas, and expert at hiding my true intentions. In some ways, I'd become more like Michael than I cared to admit. Someone who could smile and lie simultaneously. Someone who could maintain intimate relationships while pursuing secret agendas. But there was a crucial difference between Michael's deception and mine. His lies were designed to steal from and manipulate people who trusted him. My deception was designed to expose the truth and seek justice for crimes committed against me. His secrecy served greed and selfishness. Mine served truth and accountability. We'd both become skilled manipulators, but we were using those skills for fundamentally different purposes. The realization that I'd developed many of the same capabilities as my criminal husband was both disturbing and empowering. It meant that I could anticipate his moves because I understood his mindset. It meant that I could out-manipulate a manipulator because I'd learned his techniques while maintaining moral clarity about my purpose. Michael had created his own worst enemy by forcing his wife to become as calculating and strategic as he was. Rachel called me a few days later with news that sent chills down my spine. She'd been consulting on a case involving real estate fraud and had come across Michael's name in connection with a federal investigation. Apparently, the Treasury Department wasn't just looking at his recent offshore transfers. They were conducting a comprehensive audit of all his business activities going back 7 years. Rachel wanted to warn me that I might be contacted by federal investigators as part of their inquiry into Michael's financial crimes. I thanked Rachel for the warning while internally celebrating this development. Federal investigators would have access to resources and authority that far exceeded anything available in a civil divorce proceeding. They could compel banks to provide records, force international financial institutions to cooperate with their investigation, and pursue criminal charges that would send Michael to federal prison. My 3 years of documentation had provided the foundation for exposing his crimes, but the federal government would finish the job with thoroughness and authority I could never match. The first federal agent contacted me 3 weeks later. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division wanted to interview me about my knowledge of Michael's business activities. She was professional but intense, clearly someone who'd spent years investigating complex white-collar crimes. I agreed to meet with her at the federal building in downtown Austin, bringing my attorney Patricia to ensure that my cooperation wouldn't compromise my divorce proceedings. Agent Rodriguez's questions were precise and well-informed. She already knew about the offshore accounts, the shell corporations, and the fake consulting companies. She understood the structure of Michael's money laundering operation and had identified several of his accomplices. What she needed from me was insider information about his behavior, his associates, and his methods of operation. She wanted to understand how Michael had managed to operate such a sophisticated criminal enterprise while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate businessman. I answered Agent Rodriguez's questions honestly but carefully. I described Michael's secretive behavior, his unexplained absences, and his increasing paranoia about business matters. I mentioned his partnerships with people I'd never met, his insistence on handling our tax preparations personally, and his habit of conducting business conversations in private locations. I provided context and background that would help the agents understand Michael's psychology and methods without revealing the extent of my own investigation. The interview lasted 3 hours, and by the end, I could tell that Agent Rodriguez saw me as a valuable witness rather than a potential accomplice. She understood that I'd been victimized by Michael's crimes, not complicit in them. More importantly, she seemed to recognize that I possessed analytical skills and observational abilities that could be useful to their investigation. She asked if I'd be willing to provide additional assistance if needed, and I agreed without hesitation. Walking out of the federal building, I felt a sense of validation that went beyond personal satisfaction. The FBI's interest in Michael's activities confirmed that my 3 years of investigation had uncovered genuine criminal behavior, not just marital misconduct. The evidence I'd collected wasn't just useful for divorce proceedings, it was contributing to a federal criminal case that could result in decades of prison time for Michael and his accomplices. But the federal investigation also meant that my divorce case was about to become much more complicated. Criminal proceedings would take priority over civil matters, which could delay the final resolution of our divorce. Michael's assets might be frozen by federal authorities, making it impossible to divide them until the criminal case was resolved. I might have to wait years to see the financial justice I'd been seeking, but the wait would be worth it if Michael ended up in federal prison. Patricia warned me that Michael's legal strategy would probably change dramatically once he learned about the federal investigation. His attorneys would shift from trying to hide assets to trying to negotiate plea deals and minimize criminal exposure. They might even try to claim that I'd been complicit in his crimes, hoping to reduce his culpability by spreading blame to other family members. I needed to be prepared for attacks on my character and credibility as Michael became increasingly desperate. The psychological pressure of maintaining my double life was becoming almost unbearable. I was simultaneously playing the role of the betrayed wife in divorce proceedings, the helpful witness in a federal investigation, and the secret investigator who'd been building evidence for 3 years. Each role required different emotional responses and different levels of knowledge, and keeping them separate was mentally exhausting. But the strain was worth it because I could see that Michael was beginning to crack under the pressure. His behavior became increasingly erratic as he realized that investigators were closing in on his criminal activities. He started making mistakes. That would have been unthinkable during the early years of our marriage, when his deception had been careful and methodical. The man who'd once been a master of manipulation was losing control of his own narrative. Michael's relationship with Stephanie also began showing signs of stress. I'd been monitoring their interactions through social media and mutual friends, and it was clear that the federal investigation was creating tension between them. Stephanie had probably assumed that her affair with Michael would lead to a comfortable life funded by his stolen assets. Instead, she was watching her boyfriend become the target of a criminal investigation that could destroy both their futures. The most satisfying moment came when I learned that Michael had tried to withdraw money from one of his offshore accounts, only to discover that it had been frozen by federal authorities. He'd spent years moving money to the Cayman Islands specifically, to keep it beyond the reach of divorce courts and creditors. But federal investigators had the authority to access those accounts as part of their criminal investigation. His most sophisticated asset protection strategy had been neutralized by the very criminal behavior it was designed to facilitate. I realized that Michael's downfall was the inevitable result of his own greed and arrogance. If he'd been content with hiding a reasonable amount of money, he might have escaped detection. If he'd limited his crimes to asset concealment rather than expanding into investor fraud, he might have avoided federal attention. If he'd treated his wife with basic respect rather than contempt, he never would have motivated her to conduct such a thorough investigation. But Michael's personality had made his destruction inevitable. He was someone who always needed more money, more power, more control, more admiration. He couldn't be satisfied with stealing from his wife. He had to steal from his clients. 2. He couldn't be content with hiding assets. He had to create an elaborate criminal enterprise. He couldn't simply leave his marriage. He had to humiliate and impoverish the woman who'd trusted him. His own greed and cruelty had provided me with the motivation and evidence I needed to destroy him completely. As I prepared for the next phase of the legal proceedings, I felt a calmness that surprised me. 3 years of investigation had taught me patience, planning, and strategic thinking. I'd learned to control my emotions, anticipate my opponents' moves, and think several steps ahead. Most importantly, I'd learned that I was far more capable and resilient than I'd ever imagined. The naive woman who'd trusted her husband blindly was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that the world could be a dangerous place, that people could be cruel and deceptive, and that survival sometimes required developing skills and instincts that weren't particularly admirable. I'd been forced to become harder and more calculating than I'd ever wanted to be, but I'd also discovered strengths I'd never known I possessed. Michael had intended to destroy my life and leave me financially ruined and emotionally broken. Instead, his betrayal had forced me to become the most dangerous opponent he'd ever faced. He'd created his own nemesis by underestimating the woman he'd chosen to victimize. Now it was time for him to discover just how completely he'd miscalculated the character and capabilities of his wife. The federal investigation was moving forward with the inexorable power of the American justice system. Michael's assets were being traced, his accomplices were being identified, and his criminal enterprise was being dismantled piece by piece. But I knew that the most satisfying moment was still to come. The moment when Michael would finally understand that his downfall had been orchestrated by the woman he'd dismissed as too trusting and naive to pose any threat to his plans. I'd spent 3 years building the case that would destroy him, and soon the whole world would see the evidence I'd compiled. Michael Thompson, the charming real estate developer who'd fooled investors and clients for years, was about to be exposed as the criminal he'd always been. And the woman who'd uncovered his crimes was no longer the trusting wife he'd married. She was the architect of his complete and total destruction. The invitation arrived on expensive cream-colored cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that screamed new money desperation. Michael Thompson and Stephanie Walsh cordially requested my presence at their engagement celebration at the Hill Country Club, Austin's most exclusive venue. The irony was exquisite. Michael was throwing a party to celebrate his future while federal agents were building a case that would ensure he had no future at all. I stared at the invitation for a long moment, understanding that this wasn't a mistake or an oversight. This was Michael's final psychological gambit, his attempt to demonstrate that he'd moved on completely and successfully from our marriage. He wanted me to see him celebrating with Stephanie, surrounded by the same friends and business associates who'd watched our marriage dissolve. He was trying to prove that destroying my life had been worth it, that his new relationship justified all the pain he'd caused. But Michael had miscalculated once again. He'd assumed that seeing him happy with another woman would be devastating to my self-esteem and emotional stability. He'd expected me to either stay away in humiliation or attend and provide him with the satisfaction of witnessing my discomfort. What he hadn't anticipated was that I would attend as the architect of his destruction, carrying with me the evidence that would transform his celebration into the most public humiliation of his life. I called Patricia immediately. The engagement party represented the perfect opportunity to serve Michael with the amended divorce petition that included all the evidence of his hidden assets and financial crimes. More importantly, it would be the ideal setting to present him with the federal subpoena that Agent Rodriguez had asked me to deliver. Michael would be surrounded by his business associates, clients, and potential investors when he learned that his criminal enterprise had been exposed and that federal prosecutors were preparing charges against him. Patricia was initially hesitant about the dramatic timing, concerned that serving legal papers at a social event might be seen as vindictive rather than strategic. But when I explained my reasoning, she understood the psychological advantages of confronting Michael in front of the very people he'd been defrauding. His investors needed to know that their money was at risk. His business partners needed to understand their potential legal exposure, and his friends needed to see who Michael really was beneath his charming facade. We spent the next week preparing for what would essentially be a coordinated legal ambush. Patricia would serve the amended divorce petition, which now included forensic evidence of Michael's hidden assets worth over $8 million. Agent Rodriguez would serve the federal subpoena requiring Michael to appear before a grand jury investigating his financial crimes. Dr. Chen would present her forensic analysis to any investors who wanted to understand how their money had been stolen. And I would finally reveal the 3 years of evidence I'd compiled against my own husband. The psychological preparation was almost as important as the legal preparation. I'd been living a double life for 3 years, maintaining the facade of the betrayed wife while secretly building a case against Michael. The engagement party would be the moment when I finally dropped that facade and revealed who I'd actually become. I was no longer the trusting woman Michael had married. I was the investigator who'd uncovered his crimes, the strategist who'd orchestrated his downfall, and the adversary who'd proven more dangerous than he'd ever imagined possible. I chose my outfit carefully for the engagement party. A navy blue dress that was elegant but not flashy, professional but not intimidating. I wanted to look like someone who belonged in that environment, someone who had every right to be there, someone who couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Most importantly, I wanted to look like someone who was completely in control of the situation, because that's exactly what I was. The Hill Country Club was exactly what I'd expected. Old money trying too hard to impress new money, with crystal chandeliers and marble floors that whispered expensive taste to anyone insecure enough to be impressed. Michael had rented the main ballroom, filled it with white roses and champagne fountains, and invited everyone who'd ever invested money with Thompson Development. It was the perfect setting for a public reckoning. I arrived fashionably late, allowing Michael and Stephanie to receive their guests and settle into the comfortable rhythm of accepting congratulations. I wanted them relaxed and confident when their world collapsed around them. As I walked through the ballroom, I recognized faces from Michael's business world, investors who'd trusted him with their retirement savings, contractors who'd worked on his fake development projects, and clients who had no idea their money was funding his lavish lifestyle. Michael saw me first, his face cycling through surprise, confusion, and barely concealed panic in the space of a few seconds. He'd sent the invitation as a power play, but he hadn't actually expected me to attend. My presence at his engagement party was a psychological checkmate that he wasn't prepared to handle. I smiled and walked directly toward him, watching his confidence evaporate with each step I took. Stephanie was standing beside Michael, wearing a diamond ring that I recognized from the receipt I'd photographed months earlier. She'd probably thought she was getting a romantic gesture, but I knew she was wearing evidence of Michael's financial crimes. The ring had been purchased with money stolen from his investors, making it technically evidence in a federal fraud case. Even her engagement ring was tainted by Michael's criminal activities. The conversation around us gradually quieted as people noticed the tension between Michael and me. He was clearly struggling to maintain his composure, torn between wanting to confront me privately and needing to maintain his public image as the successful businessman celebrating his engagement. I let him struggle for a moment, enjoying the sight of a master manipulator who'd finally encountered a situation he couldn't control. Then I spoke, my voice carrying clearly across the sudden quiet of the ballroom. Michael, congratulations on your engagement. I hope Stephanie knows what she's getting into. The words were perfectly innocent on the surface, but everyone present could hear the implication underneath. I was suggesting that Stephanie didn't fully understand Michael's character, and the suggestion was landing exactly as I'd intended. Michael tried to respond with his usual charm, but I could see the strain in his smile. Jessica, thank you for coming. I know this situation is difficult, but I hope we can be civil for everyone's sake. He was trying to position me as the bitter ex-wife whose presence was inappropriate and uncomfortable, but his nervous energy was undermining his attempt at authority. That's when Patricia appeared at my elbow, carrying a thick manila envelope that everyone in the room could see. Michael's eyes fixed on the envelope with the intensity of a man who knew his destruction was imminent. "Mr. Thompson," Patricia said formally, "you've been served with an amended petition in the matter of Thompson versus Thompson." She handed him the envelope with the ceremony of a judge delivering a verdict. Michael's hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope and began reading the first page of the amended petition. I watched his face change as he realized what he was looking at. Detailed evidence of every hidden account, every shell corporation, every fraudulent transaction I'd documented over 3 years. His carefully constructed lies were laid out in black and white, supported by bank records, photographs, and recorded conversations that made denial impossible. But the amended petition was just the beginning. Agent Rodriguez materialized beside Patricia, her FBI credentials clearly visible on her jacket. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Special Agent Rodriguez with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. You're hereby served with a federal grand jury subpoena requiring your appearance in connection with an ongoing investigation into money laundering and investor fraud." She handed him a second envelope, this one bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. The ballroom had gone completely silent except for the soft sound of Michael's breathing, which had become rapid and shallow. Every person in the room was watching him read documents that were clearly destroying his world in real time. His business associates were beginning to understand that they might be dealing with a federal criminal. His investors were realizing that their money might be gone forever. His friends were discovering that the man they'd known was a complete fiction. Stephanie grabbed Michael's arm, her voice sharp with panic. "What is this? What are they talking about?" She was beginning to understand that her fairy tale engagement was actually a nightmare, that the man she'd helped destroy a marriage for was himself about to be destroyed by forces far beyond her control. Michael looked around the room, seeing the faces of everyone he'd been defrauding for years. His investors, his business partners, his clients, all of them were staring at him with expressions of shock, betrayal, and growing anger. The charming facade he'd maintained for so long was crumbling under the weight of documented evidence and federal attention. That's when I stepped forward and delivered the words I'd been rehearsing for 3 years. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting your celebration, but I thought you should know that the FBI has been investigating Michael's business activities for several months. Many of you have invested money with Thompson Development, and you have the right to know that. Your investments may have been diverted to fund Michael's personal expenses, including this engagement party." The reaction was immediate and devastating. Voices rose in anger and confusion as investors demanded explanations that Michael couldn't provide. Business partners began calculating their potential legal exposure to his criminal activities. Even the catering staff looked uncomfortable, probably wondering if they were going to be paid for their services. Dr. Chen appeared beside me, carrying a briefcase full of forensic evidence. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic accountant who's been analyzing Mr. Thompson's financial records. If any of you would like to understand how your investments were handled, I have detailed reports available." She opened her briefcase and began distributing copies of her analysis to anyone who wanted them. Michael tried desperately to regain control of the situation. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice cracking with strain. "My ex-wife is trying to sabotage my engagement because she can't accept that our marriage is over. These allegations are completely false." But his denials sounded hollow when confronted with detailed forensic evidence and federal subpoenas. I let Michael make his excuses for a moment before delivering the final blow. "Actually, Michael, I have recordings of conversations where you discuss your asset hiding strategies with your business partners. Would you like me to play them for everyone here?" I pulled out my phone, showing him that I had the recordings readily available. The color drained from his face as he realized that I'd been documenting his crimes for years. The crowd was beginning to turn hostile. Investors were demanding immediate explanations about their money. Business partners were denying knowledge of any illegal activities. Clients were threatening to report Thompson Development to regulatory authorities. Michael's engagement party had transformed into a public tribunal, where he was being judged by everyone he'd been deceiving. Stephanie finally understood the magnitude of the situation. She pulled off her engagement ring and threw it at Michael's feet, her voice shaking with rage. "You told me you were getting divorced because your wife didn't understand your business success. You never mentioned that your business was criminal." She stormed out of the ballroom, leaving Michael to face the consequences of his crimes alone. Agent Rodriguez took control of the situation with the authority of federal law enforcement. Ladies and gentlemen, if any of you believe you may have been victims of financial fraud, please provide your contact information to my office. We'll be conducting interviews as part of our ongoing investigation. She began distributing business cards to the crowd of potential victims. Michael stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the ruins of his carefully constructed life. His hidden assets had been exposed. His criminal activities were under federal investigation. His business relationships were destroyed, and his engagement was over. The man who'd thought he was smarter than everyone around him had been undone by the wife he'd dismissed as too naive to pose any threat. I watched Michael's complete humiliation with a satisfaction that was both profound and peaceful. This wasn't the emotional revenge of a betrayed spouse. It was the logical consequence of a criminal's own choices. Every person turning away from him in disgust, every investor demanding accountability, every federal charge he would eventually face was the direct result of decisions he'd made freely and deliberately. As the ballroom emptied and Michael stood alone among the scattered papers and abandoned champagne glasses, I felt a transformation completing itself inside me. The scared, trusting woman who'd discovered her husband's first hidden transaction 3 years ago was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that strength didn't come from trusting others. It came from trusting yourself, documenting everything, and never underestimating your own capabilities. 3 months later, I received a call from Agent Rodriguez with news that Michael had been indicted on 17 federal charges, including money laundering, investor fraud, and tax evasion. His assets had been frozen, his business had been dissolved, and he was facing 30 years in federal prison. The investigation had uncovered over $12 million in stolen funds, most of which would be returned to his victims through asset forfeiture proceedings. The divorce settlement was finalized a week after Michael's indictment. With his hidden assets exposed and his criminal activities documented, the court awarded me everything I was legally entitled to: the house, half of his legitimate business assets, and substantial spousal support that would be paid from the proceeds of asset sales. Michael's attempt to leave me financially devastated had instead resulted in his own complete financial destruction. I sold the lakefront house where I'd lived with Michael for 8 years. Too many memories, too much contamination from his lies and deception. Instead, I bought a downtown loft with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in streams of natural light. The space was clean, modern, and completely mine. No history of betrayal, no hidden surveillance equipment, no remnants of a marriage built on fraud. My relationship with my family slowly healed as they came to understand what I'd endured and accomplished. Amanda apologized for not recognizing the signs of Michael's deception, and my parents expressed pride in my strength and intelligence. They'd initially seen my divorce as a failure, but they now understood it as a victory over someone who'd tried to destroy their daughter's life. Rachel became my closest friend and professional collaborator. Her forensic accounting firm hired me as a consultant, specializing in cases involving hidden assets and financial fraud. My unique perspective as someone who'd conducted a successful 3-year investigation of her own husband made me invaluable in helping other women uncover similar deceptions. But the most profound change was internal. I'd learned that I was capable of things I'd never imagined: strategic thinking, long-term planning, emotional control under extreme pressure, and the ability to outmaneuver someone who'd underestimated my intelligence and determination. Michael's betrayal had forced me to discover strengths I'd never known I possessed. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a letter from Michael in federal prison. He wanted to apologize, to explain his actions, to somehow make amends for what he'd done to our marriage and my life. I read the letter once, then burned it in my fireplace. Some apologies are too little and too late, and some bridges are meant to stay burned. I never responded to Michael's letter, but if I had, I would have told him that his betrayal was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to stop being naive and start being strategic. It taught me to trust evidence rather than promises. It showed me that my greatest enemy could become my greatest teacher if I paid attention to the lessons they were offering. Michael had intended to steal my money, destroy my confidence, and leave me broken and powerless. Instead, his crimes had turned me into someone who understood how the world really worked, who knew how to protect herself, and who would never again be anyone's victim. He'd tried to erase me from his story, but I'd ended up writing the final chapter of his. Today, I wake up every morning in my sunlit loft, grateful for the woman I've become. I'm not the trusting wife I used to be, and I'm never going to be that person again. I'm someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who might try to deceive me. Michael Thompson taught me that the world can be a cruel place, but he also taught me that I'm strong enough to thrive in it. The naive woman who'd believed in fairness and honesty had been destroyed by her husband's betrayal. But from those ashes had emerged someone who understood that real strength comes not from trusting others, but from trusting yourself completely. Someone who knows that the best revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming so successful that your betrayers become irrelevant to your story. I built a new life from the foundation of my own intelligence and determination. Michael had given me the motivation to discover who I really was, and the woman I discovered was someone he never could have controlled or manipulated. His greatest crime wasn't stealing my money, it was underestimating my capacity to fight back. And that miscalculation cost him everything he'd ever worked to build. The first year after Michael's sentencing passed like pages turning in a book, I was finally allowed to write myself. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison had delivered a verdict that satisfied even my carefully cultivated sense of justice. 22 years in federal prison, full restitution to victims, and forfeiture of every asset he'd tried to hide. The man, who'd spent years stealing from investors and lying to his wife, would spend the next 2 decades in a 6x8 cell, with plenty of time to contemplate the consequences of his choices. I received updates about the case through Agent Rodriguez, who'd become something of a friend during the investigation. She told me that Michael had initially tried to maintain his innocence, claiming that his wife had fabricated evidence against him out of spite. But the recordings I'd collected, combined with the forensic analysis Dr. Chen had performed, created an airtight case that left no room for denial. Even Michael's expensive legal team had eventually advised him to accept a plea bargain rather than risk an even longer sentence at trial. The restitution payments began arriving in my account 6 months after sentencing, as federal marshals liquidated Michael's seized assets and distributed the proceeds to his victims. I received checks for amounts I'd never imagined seeing, my share of the $8 million he'd hidden, plus damages for emotional distress and punitive awards that reflected the court's disgust with his systematic deception. The money felt different from anything I'd earned through my own work, heavier somehow, as if it carried the weight of everything I'd endured to obtain it. But the financial recovery was only part of my healing process. The real transformation happened in the quiet moments when I realized I was no longer afraid. For 3 years during my investigation, I'd lived with constant anxiety about being discovered, about Michael finding my evidence files, about my plan failing at a crucial moment. Even after his arrest, I'd worried about retaliation from his business associates or legal challenges to my documentation methods. Now, with Michael locked away and his entire criminal network dismantled, I could finally exhale completely. My new consulting business grew faster than I'd anticipated. Word spread through Austin's legal community about the woman who'd single-handedly uncovered a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, and divorce attorneys began referring clients who suspected their spouses were hiding assets. I specialized in cases that reminded me of my own experience. Intelligent women who'd noticed financial inconsistencies but weren't sure how to document them, wives who'd been gaslit into questioning their own observations, and mothers who needed to protect their children's financial security from deceptive partners. Each case taught me something new about the psychology of financial deception and the techniques people use to hide money from their families. I encountered offshore trusts in the Bahamas, shell corporations in Delaware, cryptocurrency accounts in digital wallets, and real estate purchased under fictitious names. The methods varied, but the underlying pattern was always the same. Someone, with financial access and expertise, systematically stealing from someone who trusted them completely. My most challenging case involved a woman named Catherine Williams, whose husband had been hiding assets for over a decade through an elaborate network of family trusts and business partnerships. Catherine was a pediatric nurse who'd spent her career caring for children while her husband built what appeared to be a successful medical device company. She'd begun to suspect financial irregularities when she noticed that their lifestyle didn't match his reported income, but she lacked the technical knowledge to trace complex corporate structures. Working with Catherine reminded me of my own journey from suspicion to certainty. She had the same combination of intelligence and emotional investment that had driven my investigation, but she needed guidance about which evidence would be legally admissible and which investigation techniques might compromise her case. I taught her how to photograph documents without leaving traces, how to research corporate filings online, and how to identify the warning signs of money laundering operations. The investigation took 8 months, but we eventually uncovered over $4 million in hidden assets spread across multiple jurisdictions. Catherine's husband had been diverting insurance payments from his medical device sales into accounts that existed only on paper, then using that money to fund a lifestyle that included a second home in Colorado and a boat he'd registered under his brother's name. The evidence we compiled led to criminal charges and a divorce settlement that secured Catherine's financial future. Each successful case reinforced my understanding that financial deception was rarely an isolated incident. People who stole from their spouses usually stole from others as well: business partners, clients, investors, and anyone else who trusted them with money. Michael's crimes against me had been part of a broader pattern of exploitation that had harmed dozens of people. By exposing his deception, I'd protected not only myself, but everyone else who might have fallen victim to his schemes. My relationship with my family continued to evolve as they processed everything that had happened. My parents, Gloria and Robert, struggled with guilt about not recognizing Michael's true nature during our marriage. They'd liked him, trusted him, and welcomed him into our family without question. Learning that their son-in-law had been a career criminal who'd systematically stolen from their daughter was a revelation that challenged their faith in their own judgment. Amanda dealt with her own guilt about not providing more support during my marriage. She'd sensed that something was wrong, but had attributed my stress to normal marital problems rather than criminal victimization. The recordings I'd eventually played for her, conversations where Michael discussed his plans to impoverish his wife, were so shocking that she couldn't listen to more than a few minutes without becoming physically ill. But my family's guilt gradually transformed into pride, as they understood the scope of what I'd accomplished. I'd identified a sophisticated criminal enterprise, documented it methodically for 3 years, and provided evidence that led to federal prosecution and complete restitution. The woman they'd worried about during the divorce proceedings had actually been conducting one of the most successful financial investigations in recent Texas history. Rachel became more than a friend. She became a business partner in my consulting firm. Her forensic accounting expertise combined perfectly with my investigative experience, and we developed a reputation for handling the most complex asset hiding cases in the state. Our partnership was built on mutual respect and complementary skills, but it was also built on our shared understanding that financial deception was a form of domestic abuse that deserved the same serious response as physical violence. We worked together on cases that ranged from simple bank account concealment to international money laundering schemes that spanned multiple countries. Each case reinforced my belief that financial abuse was far more common than most people realized, and that women were particularly vulnerable to this type of exploitation because they were often excluded from family financial management or discouraged from asking detailed questions about money. One case that particularly affected me involved a woman whose husband had been stealing her inheritance for 15 years. Maria Santos had received a substantial settlement from her father's estate, but her husband had convinced her to let him manage the money while she focused on raising their children. Over the years, he'd gradually transferred her inheritance into accounts that existed only in his name, using the money to fund business ventures that enriched him personally while impoverishing his family. Maria's case was complicated by the fact that some of the asset transfers had occurred with her consent, even though she hadn't understood their legal implications. Her husband had presented the transfers as temporary business necessities or tax advantages, always promising that the money would be returned to their joint accounts. By the time Maria realized that her inheritance was gone, her husband had already filed for divorce and was claiming that the stolen money had always been his separate property. The investigation took over a year, but we eventually traced every dollar of Maria's stolen inheritance and proved that her husband had obtained her consent through deliberate misrepresentation. The evidence we compiled showed a pattern of financial manipulation that spanned their entire marriage, with Maria's inheritance being just the largest and most recent theft. The court awarded her complete restitution, plus damages for emotional distress, but more importantly, it validated her experience and confirmed that she'd been victimized rather than simply naive. Working on cases like Maria's helped me understand that my own experience with Michael, while dramatic and well-documented, was part of a much larger pattern of financial abuse that affected thousands of women every year. Men used their greater financial literacy, their control over family assets, and their wives' trust to systematically steal money that should have supported the entire family. The crime was often invisible because it happened within marriage, where financial secrecy could be disguised as business necessity or investment strategy. My work also taught me that the psychological impact of financial deception often lasted longer than the economic damage. Women who'd been financially abused struggled with self-doubt and anxiety long after their money had been recovered. They questioned their judgment, their intelligence, and their ability to protect themselves from future exploitation. Recovery required not just financial restitution, but psychological healing from the trauma of systematic betrayal. I began speaking at conferences for divorce attorneys and forensic accountants, sharing techniques I'd developed for identifying and documenting hidden assets. My presentations always emphasized that successful financial investigations required both technical skills and psychological insight. Investigators needed to understand not just how money could be hidden, but why certain personality types were drawn to financial deception and how they justified their crimes to themselves. The psychological profile of financial abusers was remarkably consistent across cases. They were typically narcissistic individuals who saw their partners as possessions rather than equals, who believed they were entitled to control family resources, and who viewed their superior financial knowledge as license to exploit their spouse's trust. They were often charming and manipulative in their personal relationships, skilled at maintaining facades of respectability while conducting systematic theft behind the scenes. Michael had fit this profile perfectly. His charm and business success had made him attractive to investors and romantic partners. But underneath the appealing exterior was someone who saw other people as resources to be exploited, rather than individuals deserving of respect. His marriage to me had been a long-term con game, designed to provide him with financial cover while he built his criminal enterprise. Understanding Michael's psychology helped me heal from the personal betrayal I'd experienced. His deception hadn't been a reflection of my inadequacy or naivety. It had been the predictable behavior of someone with a personality disorder that made him incapable of genuine emotional connection. I'd been victimized not because I was weak or stupid, but because I'd possessed qualities, trust, loyalty, love, that made me vulnerable to someone who didn't share those qualities. 3 years after Michael's sentencing, I received a letter from him that I almost didn't open. Federal prisoners were allowed limited correspondence, and I'd specifically requested that the Bureau of Prisons not forward any communications from him to my address. But this letter had arrived through his attorney, marked as legal correspondence that I needed to review for potential civil litigation purposes. The letter was different from his previous attempts at communication. Instead of apologies or justifications, it contained a detailed confession of financial crimes that hadn't been covered in his federal prosecution. Michael claimed that he was providing this information as part of his rehabilitation process, but I suspected that he was actually trying to clear his conscience before appealing his sentence or applying for early release. The confession described additional hidden assets that federal investigators had never discovered, including cryptocurrency accounts worth over $2 million and real estate partnerships in other states that had been structured to avoid detection during asset forfeiture proceedings. Michael provided account numbers, passwords, and contact information for business associates who could verify his claims. If the information was accurate, it would lead to additional restitution for his victims and longer prison sentences for his accomplices. I forwarded the letter to Agent Rodriguez, who confirmed that Michael's information was leading to new investigations and asset recoveries. Apparently, prison had given him time to reflect on the scope of his criminal activities, and he'd decided that complete disclosure was his only path to eventual redemption. Whether his motivations were genuine or calculated, his cooperation was helping investigators recover money that had been considered permanently lost. The additional asset recovery meant that my restitution payments increased substantially, but the money felt less important than the validation of my original investigation. Michael's confession confirmed that his criminal activities had been even more extensive than I'd documented, which meant that my 3-year investigation had uncovered only part of his deception. If I'd been more thorough or more suspicious, I might have exposed even more of his crimes and protected additional victims from financial harm. But I also recognized that my investigation had been limited by my position as Michael's wife and my need to maintain operational security. I'd been conducting covert surveillance while living with my target, which required a delicate balance between gathering evidence and maintaining my cover. Under those circumstances, uncovering $8 million in hidden assets and providing evidence for a successful federal prosecution was actually a remarkable achievement. My consulting business continued to grow as word spread about my success rate in complex asset hiding cases. I hired additional investigators and forensic accountants, building a team that could handle multiple cases simultaneously while maintaining the attention to detail that had made my original investigation successful. Our firm became known throughout Texas as the place divorce attorneys sent their most challenging financial cases. Each new case reinforced my understanding that financial deception was a solvable problem that required systematic investigation and professional expertise. People who hid assets always made mistakes because greed and arrogance eventually overcame their caution. They left paper trails that could be followed, created patterns that could be analyzed, and made statements that could be contradicted with documentary evidence. The most satisfying cases were those where we recovered assets that had been hidden for decades. I worked with elderly women whose husbands had been stealing their retirement savings for years, mothers whose ex-husbands were hiding income to avoid child support payments, and widows who discovered that their deceased husbands had maintained secret financial lives that their families knew nothing about. One particularly memorable case involved a woman whose husband had died suddenly, leaving behind what appeared to be substantial debts and minimal assets. Linda Parker had been married for 30 years to a man who managed all their finances and assured her that their future was secure. After his death, she discovered that their retirement accounts were empty, their house was mortgaged beyond its value, and their credit cards were maxed out. Linda's adult children assumed that their father had been a poor financial manager or had fallen victim to investment fraud. But Linda's instincts told her that something more deliberate had happened. She hired my firm to investigate her husband's financial activities in the years before his death, hoping to understand how their comfortable lifestyle had been built on such a foundation of debt. The investigation revealed that Linda's husband had been systematically liquidating their joint assets and transferring the money to accounts in his children's names from his previous marriage. He'd been planning to leave Linda financially destitute while ensuring that his biological children inherited the wealth he'd accumulated during their marriage. His sudden death had prevented him from completing the transfer, but he'd already moved over $3 million out of their joint estate. The evidence we compiled allowed Linda to challenge the asset transfers in probate court and recover the money her husband had stolen from their marital estate. More importantly, it validated her intuition that her husband's financial crisis hadn't been accidental. She'd been systematically defrauded by someone she'd trusted completely, and our investigation proved that her suspicions had been justified. Cases like Linda's reinforced my belief that women's intuition about financial irregularities was almost always accurate. When wives suspected that their husbands were hiding money, they were usually right. The problem was that they often lacked the technical knowledge or investigative resources to prove their suspicions, which allowed the deception to continue unchallenged. My work became more than a business. It became a mission to help women trust their instincts and fight back against financial abuse. Every successful case was a victory not just for my individual client, but for every woman who'd been told she was imagining problems that didn't exist, or who'd been convinced that financial complexity was beyond her understanding. 5 years after Michael's sentencing, I received news that he'd died in federal prison from complications related to diabetes. The disease had apparently been undiagnosed during our marriage, which explained some of the mood swings and erratic behavior I'd noticed in his final years of freedom. His death meant that his appeals were dismissed, and his restitution obligations were satisfied from his estate. I felt no satisfaction at Michael's death, but I also felt no grief. He'd been dead to me since the day I discovered his betrayal, and his physical death simply made that emotional reality official. The man I'd loved had never really existed. He'd been a carefully constructed fiction designed to hide a criminal, who saw his wife as both accomplice and victim in his schemes. Michael's obituary, written by his family, described him as a successful businessman who'd struggled with personal demons, but had tried to make amends for his mistakes. There was no mention of his criminal convictions, his victims, or the lives he'd destroyed through his deception. Even in death, people were trying to protect his reputation and minimize the impact of his crimes. I wrote my own obituary for Michael, not for publication, but for my own closure. My version described him as a sociopathic criminal who'd spent years stealing from investors and abusing his wife's trust, who'd been exposed by his victim's superior intelligence and determination, and who'd died in prison after receiving appropriate punishment for his crimes. It was the truth that his family couldn't bear to acknowledge, but it was the only version that honored the experiences of everyone he'd harmed. Today, 10 years after filing for divorce, I wake up every morning in the life I've built from the foundation of my own strength and intelligence. My consulting firm employs 12 people and handles over 100 cases per year. I've helped recover more than $50 million in hidden assets and provided evidence for dozens of criminal prosecutions. The naive woman who trusted her husband blindly has become one of the most successful financial investigators in the country. My personal life has also flourished in ways I never expected during the dark years of my marriage. I'm in a relationship with David Martinez, a federal prosecutor who understands my work and respects my independence. David prosecutes white-collar criminals, and we often compare notes about the psychology of financial predators and the techniques they use to exploit their victims. Our relationship is built on mutual respect, honest communication, and the understanding that trust must be earned through consistent actions rather than charming words. David has never asked me to change my name, merge our finances, or compromise my career for his convenience. He understands that my independence isn't a rejection of commitment. It's a hard-won achievement that I'll never surrender to anyone. We maintain separate residences, separate bank accounts, and separate professional identities while building a partnership based on genuine compatibility rather than financial convenience. The contrast between my relationship with David and my marriage to Michael couldn't be more stark. Michael had wanted a wife who would enable his crimes and provide cover for his deception. David wants a partner who challenges him intellectually and professionally. Michael had seen my financial knowledge as a tool to be exploited. David sees it as an achievement to be celebrated. Michael had demanded trust without earning it. David proves his trustworthiness through daily actions that align with his words. I've learned that the most important relationship in my life is the one I have with myself. The woman who emerged from Michael's betrayal is someone I respect, admire, and trust completely. She's capable of protecting herself, fighting back against injustice, and building success on her own terms. She doesn't need anyone else's approval or validation because she's proven her worth through her own achievements. The scared, trusting woman who'd discovered her husband's first hidden transaction 10 years ago had been destroyed by his betrayal. But from her ashes had emerged someone stronger, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who might try to deceive her. Michael Thompson had tried to erase his wife from his story, but instead he'd created the architect of his own destruction. I built a new life from the foundation of my own intelligence and determination, and that life is more fulfilling than anything I could have imagined during my marriage. Michael had given me the motivation to discover who I really was, and the woman I discovered was someone he never could have controlled or manipulated. His greatest crime wasn't stealing my money, it was underestimating my capacity to fight back. And that miscalculation cost him everything he'd ever worked to build. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming so successful that your betrayers become irrelevant to your story. Today, Michael Thompson is a footnote in my biography, a cautionary tale I share with clients who need to understand that financial predators can be defeated by their intended victims. He thought he was writing a story where I was the victim and he was the clever antagonist. Instead, I became the author of my own story. And in that story, he was just an obstacle I overcame on my path to becoming who I was always meant to be. 15 years have passed since I first discovered Michael's hidden bank deposit, and the ripple effects of that investigation continue to expand in ways I never anticipated. What began as one woman's quest for justice has evolved into a movement that's changing how financial abuse is understood, investigated, and prosecuted across the country. The techniques I developed during my 3-year investigation of Michael's crimes have become standard protocols in forensic accounting firms, law enforcement agencies, and legal practices nationwide. Last month, I received an invitation to speak at the FBI National Academy about financial investigation techniques in domestic abuse cases. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same federal building where I'd once been interviewed as a victim now welcomed me as an expert consultant. Agent Rodriguez, now Deputy Director of the Financial Crimes Division, introduced me to an audience of investigators, prosecutors, and forensic specialists who'd been studying my methods for years. The presentation I delivered wasn't just about technical investigation procedures. It was about understanding the psychology of financial predators and their victims. I explained how Michael's personality traits had made his crimes predictable, and how his victims' emotional investments had been systematically exploited. But I also emphasized that those same emotional investments, when channeled into methodical investigation, could become the predator's greatest weakness. The questions from the audience revealed how widespread financial abuse had become in modern society. Investigators shared cases involving cryptocurrency hiding, international shell companies, and sophisticated money laundering schemes that made Michael's operations look primitive by comparison. But they also shared stories of victims who'd used my investigative framework to expose crimes that would otherwise have remained hidden forever. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a psychology professor from the University of Texas, approached me after the presentation with a proposal that would change the trajectory of my career once again. She wanted to collaborate on a comprehensive study of financial abuse patterns, using data from my consulting firm's cases to identify warning signs that could help potential victims recognize danger before they were financially devastated. The research project took 2 years to complete, But the results were groundbreaking. We analyzed over 300 cases of documented financial abuse and identified consistent behavioral patterns that preceded major asset hiding operations. The study revealed that financial predators typically began with small deceptions to test their victims' awareness and response capabilities, then gradually escalated to more sophisticated crimes based on their assessment of detection risk. More importantly, the research showed that victims who trusted their instincts and conducted systematic investigations were far more likely to recover their assets and achieve legal justice than those who relied on conventional discovery methods. During divorce proceedings, the women who'd been labeled as paranoid or vindictive for suspecting their husband's financial deception were actually demonstrating superior threat assessment capabilities that should have been encouraged rather than dismissed. The study's publication in the Journal of Forensic Psychology created immediate controversy within the legal community. Defense attorneys argued that our research would encourage vindictive spouses to conduct unauthorized surveillance operations against their partners. Prosecutors countered that the research provided crucial insights into crimes that were often dismissed as civil disputes rather than criminal behavior. But the strongest response came from women who'd been victims of financial abuse and recognized their own experiences in our case studies. Support groups formed around the country, bringing together women who'd survived financial deception and wanted to help others avoid similar exploitation. The online community that emerged from these groups became a powerful resource for sharing investigation techniques, legal strategies, and emotional support. My consulting firm evolved to meet the growing demand for financial investigation training and support. We developed online courses that taught basic investigation skills to women who suspected their partners were hiding assets, but couldn't afford professional investigators. The courses covered everything from recognizing red flags in financial behavior to documenting evidence that would be admissible in court proceedings. The training programs attracted participants from across the socioeconomic spectrum. Wealthy women whose husbands controlled family trusts learned the same investigation techniques as working mothers whose partners were hiding income to avoid child support payments. The methods were universal because the psychology of financial deception was remarkably consistent regardless of the amounts involved. One of our most successful graduates was Maria Santos, the woman whose husband had been stealing her inheritance for 15 years. After recovering her own assets through our investigation, Maria became a certified financial investigator and opened her own practice, specializing in inheritance theft cases. She understood the unique psychological trauma of discovering that a trusted partner had been systematically stealing family money, and her empathy made her extraordinarily effective at helping other victims. Maria's success story was repeated dozens of times as women who'd survived financial abuse became advocates and investigators themselves. They possessed a combination of technical knowledge and emotional insight that made them uniquely qualified to help other victims. The network of survivor investigators grew into an informal but powerful support system that connected women across geographic and cultural boundaries. The legal system began adapting to the reality that financial abuse was more common and more sophisticated than previously understood. Family court judges received training about asset hiding techniques and the investigation methods needed to uncover them. Divorce attorneys learned to recognize the warning signs of financial deception and the evidence required to prove it in court. Perhaps most importantly, federal prosecutors began treating financial abuse within marriage as seriously as they treated other white-collar crimes. The artificial distinction between domestic disputes and criminal behavior started dissolving, as investigators recognized that people who stole from their spouses usually stole from others as well. My relationship with David deepened over the years as we both matured personally and professionally. His work prosecuting financial criminals gave him unique insight into my experiences with Michael, while my investigation techniques helped him understand how sophisticated criminals operated within their families. We became intellectual partners as well as romantic ones, collaborating on research projects and legal reforms that improved outcomes for financial crime victims. David proposed to me on the 10-year anniversary of my divorce from Michael, not because of the symbolism, but because he'd finally accumulated enough evidence of his own trustworthiness to justify asking for that level of commitment. His proposal included a prenuptial agreement that he'd drafted himself, protecting both our individual assets while ensuring fair treatment if our relationship ever ended. It was the most romantic gesture anyone had ever made to me because it demonstrated respect for my independence and understanding of my history. Our wedding was small and private, attended only by family members and close friends who understood our journey to that moment. Rachel served as my maid of honor, Amanda sang during the ceremony, and Agent Rodriguez offered a toast about the importance of partnerships built on truth rather than deception. The contrast with my first wedding couldn't have been more stark. This time, I was marrying someone who'd proven his character through years of consistent actions rather than someone who'd charmed me with promises he had no intention of keeping. My parents, now in their 70s, finally understood the magnitude of what I'd accomplished during those dark years of my first marriage. They'd initially seen my investigation of Michael as evidence of mistrust and paranoia, but they now recognized it as an extraordinary demonstration of intelligence and determination. Their pride in my achievements was obvious, but it was also mixed with regret that they hadn't recognized the warning signs of Michael's deception themselves. Amanda had become a fierce advocate for financial literacy education in schools, convinced that teaching young people about money management and fraud recognition could prevent future generations from falling victim to financial predators. She'd developed curriculum programs that were being implemented in high schools across Texas, teaching teenagers to recognize manipulation tactics and trust their instincts about people who seemed too good to be true. The ripple effects of my investigation extended far beyond my immediate family and professional circle. The techniques I'd developed were being used by investigators worldwide, and the legal precedents established by Michael's prosecution had strengthened financial abuse laws in multiple jurisdictions. What had begun as one woman's desperate attempt to protect herself had evolved into a systematic approach to combating a crime that affected millions of people. My consulting firm had grown into a nationwide organization with offices in 12 states and partnerships with law enforcement agencies, legal advocacy groups, and victim support organizations. We'd helped recover over $200 million in hidden assets and provided evidence for hundreds of criminal prosecutions. The naive financial analyst who'd trusted her husband blindly had become one of the most influential figures in the fight against financial crime. But the professional success, while satisfying, wasn't the most important outcome of my journey. The greatest achievement was the woman I'd become through the process of fighting back against Michael's betrayal. I'd discovered strengths I'd never known I possessed, developed skills I'd never imagined needing, and built a life that was authentically mine rather than a reflection of someone else's expectations. The scared, trusting woman who'd found that first hidden bank deposit had been destroyed by Michael's betrayal. But her destruction had been necessary for the emergence of someone stronger and more capable. I'd been forced to choose between remaining a victim and becoming a fighter, and that choice had led to personal transformation that extended far beyond recovering stolen money. I still thought about Michael occasionally, but not with anger or regret. His betrayal had been the catalyst for the most important growth period of my life, forcing me to develop capabilities I'd never have discovered under normal circumstances. He'd intended to destroy me, but instead he'd provided the motivation I needed to become the best version of myself. The investigation techniques I'd developed during my marriage to Michael were now being taught in law enforcement academies and forensic accounting programs. The psychological insights I'd gained about financial predators were informing research studies and legal reforms. The courage I'd found to fight back against systematic deception was inspiring other women to trust their instincts and demand accountability from people who'd betrayed their trust. Michael Thompson had died in federal prison believing that his crimes had been exposed through bad luck and federal overreach. He'd never understood that his downfall had been orchestrated by the wife he'd dismissed as too naive to pose any threat to his operations. His failure to recognize my capabilities had been the crucial error that led to his complete destruction. Today, when I speak to groups of women who suspect they're being financially abused, I always emphasize that their instincts are probably correct and that they possess the intelligence needed to expose their abuser's crimes. The techniques I teach them aren't complex or mysterious. They're systematic applications of common sense, patience, and attention to detail. Any woman who suspects financial deception can learn to document it effectively if she's willing to be methodical and persistent. The most important lesson I share is that surviving financial abuse isn't just about recovering stolen money. It's about reclaiming personal power and building a life based on authentic choices rather than someone else's manipulation. The investigation process itself becomes a form of healing because it transforms victims into agents of their own justice. Women who complete the journey from victim to investigator emerge with unshakable confidence in their own judgment and capabilities. They understand that they can protect themselves, fight back against injustice, and build success on their own terms. Most importantly, they know that they never again have to accept deception or abuse from anyone, regardless of that person's charm or supposed authority. My story continues to evolve as new challenges and opportunities emerge, but the foundation remains constant. I'm a woman who was betrayed by someone she trusted completely, who chose to fight back rather than accept victimization, and who discovered that her greatest enemy had inadvertently become her greatest teacher. Michael Thompson tried to write a story where I was the victim and he was the clever antagonist, but I became the author of my own narrative. And in that story, I'm the heroine who transformed betrayal into triumph. The legacy of my 3-year investigation extends far beyond my personal recovery or professional success. It's become part of a larger movement that's changing how society understands and responds to financial abuse. Every woman who trusts her instincts, documents suspicious behavior, and fights back against deception is continuing the work that began in my kitchen 15 years ago when I first opened that password-protected folder. The fight against financial predators requires constant vigilance and systematic resistance because these criminals adapt their methods as quickly as investigators develop countermeasures. But they all share the same fundamental weakness. They underestimate their victims' intelligence, determination, and capacity for growth. That underestimation creates opportunities for exposure that methodical investigators can exploit to achieve complete justice. My transformation from trusting wife to forensic investigator proves that anyone can develop the skills needed to protect themselves from financial predators. The only requirements are patience, persistence, and the courage to document uncomfortable truths about people we've trusted. Those qualities exist within every person who's ever suspected that someone was lying to them about money, and they can be developed into powerful tools for achieving justice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.